The Steam House by Jules Verne. Translated by Agnes D. Kingston. Book 2, Chapter 7. Passage of the Betwa. Our position on the 18th of September stood thus. Distance from Calcutta, 812 miles. From Sanitarium on the Himalayas, 236 miles. From Bombay, 1,000 miles. With regard to distance, not half of our proposed journey had been accomplished, but reckoning the 7 weeks spent on the Himalayan frontier, above half the time allotted to it had elapsed. We left Calcutta on the 6th of March, and in 2 months we hoped to reach the western shores of Hindustan. Avoiding the great towns concerned in the revolt of 1857, we should travel nearly due south. There being excellent roads through Sind, we should meet no difficulties until we came to the mountains of central India. The presence of an experienced man like Kalagani would give additional security as well as facility to our progress, as he seemed so thoroughly well acquainted with this part of Hindustan. Banks called him the first day, while Colonel Munro was taking his siesta, and asked in what capacity he had so frequently traversed these provinces. "I belonged," replied the man, "to one of the numerous caravans of the Brinjaris, who convey to the interior, on the backs of oxen, supplies of grain, either ordered by the government or private persons. In this capacity I have passed a score of times across the territories of North and Central India." "Do such caravans still cross this part of the peninsula?" "Yes, sir, they do, and at this season of the year I should expect to meet Brinjaris on their way north." "Well, Kalagani, you are likely to be very useful to us. We wish to avoid the great cities and to pass through the open country. You shall be our guide." "Certainly, sir," answered the Hindu, in the cold tone which was habitual to him, and to which I could never get quite reconciled. Then he added, "Shall I state in a general way the direction we shall have to take?" "Do so, Kalagani," said Banks, spreading a large map on the table, and preparing to verify by observation the information about to be given him. "It is very simple," said the Indian. "A direct line takes us from the Delhi Railroad to that of Bombay. The junction is at Allahabad. Between Etawah and the frontier of Bundelkund there is but one important river to cross, the Jumna. Between that and the Vindhyas mountains there is another, the Betwa. These 2 rivers may have overflowed their banks, but I think your train would be able to cross them, even if it were so." "There would be no serious difficulty," replied the engineer. "And having reached the Vindhyas, we should turn slightly to the southeast in order to reach a practicable pass. There will be no difficulty there either, for I know a spot where the ascents are easy. Wheel carriages prefer that way. It is the pass of Sujor." "That ought to suit us," returned Banks. "But I perceive that beyond the pass of Sujor the country is very hilly. Could we not approach the Vindhyas by crossing Bhopal?" "There are a great many towns in that direction," answered Kalagani. "It would be difficult to avoid them. The Sepoys distinguished themselves particularly there during the War of Independence." I was struck by this expression, the War of Independence, which Kalagani applied to the mutiny. However, I reflected that it was a native, not an Englishman, who used it. Besides, we had no reason to suppose that Kalagani had taken part in the revolt. "Well," resumed Banks, "leaving the cities of Bhopal to the west, Are you certain that the pass of Sador will give us access to a practicable road? To a road I have often travelled, sir, which, after making a circuit of Lake Pachiria, will bring you near Jabalpur on the Bombay Railway." "I see," said Banks, who followed on the map all that the man said. "And after that?" "After that the road turns to the southwest, and more or less runs alongside the line as far as Bombay." "Of course, so it does," returned Banks. "I see no particular difficulty anywhere, and the route suits us. We shall not forget your services, Caliganni." Caliganni made his salaam, and was about to retire, when, changing his mind, he again approached the engineer. "Have you any question to put to me?" said Banks. "I have, sir. May I be permitted to ask why you especially want to avoid the great towns of the Bundelkund?" Banks looked at me. There seemed no reason for concealing the facts of the case from this man, and after a little consideration, Colonel Munro's position was explained to him. He listened attentively to what the engineer related to him, and then he said in a tone denoting surprise, "Colonel Munro has nothing more to fear from Nana Sahib, at least not in these provinces." "Neither in these provinces nor anywhere else," returned Banks. "Why do you say 'in these provinces'?" "Because it was reported several months ago that the Nabob had reappeared in the Bombay Presidency, but by no research could his retreat be discovered, and supposing him ever to have been there, it is probable that he has now again passed beyond the Indo-Chinese frontier." This answer seemed to prove that Caliganni was ignorant of what had taken place in the Satapura Mountains, and that in the month of May Nana Sahib had been slain by British soldiers at the Pal of Tandit. "It seems that news takes a long time to reach the Himalayan forests," exclaimed Banks. Caliganni looked at him fixedly, like one not in the least comprehending his words. "You do not seem to know that Nana Sahib is dead," continued the engineer. "Nana Sahib dead?" cried the native. "Certainly," replied Banks. "Government announced the fact that he had been killed, with all the details." "Killed?" said Caliganni, shaking his head. "Where do they say that Nana Sahib was killed?" "At the Pal of Tandit, in the Satapura Mountains." "And when?" "Nearly 4 months ago, on the 25th of last May." I noticed a peculiar look flit over Caliganni's face as he folded his arms and remained silent. "Have you any reason," inquired I, "for discrediting the account of Nana Sahib's death?" "None, sir. I believe what you tell me." In another instant Banks and I were alone, and he exclaimed, "You see what these fellows are. They regard the chief of the rebel sepoys as something more than mortal, and because they have not seen him hanged, they never will believe he is dead." "Why," replied I, "that is just like the old soldiers of the Empire, who for 20 years after Napoleon's death stoutly maintained that he was still alive. Since passing across the upper Ganges 15 days previous to this, a fertile country had opened before us, called the Doab, a district lying in the angle formed by the Ganges and the Jumna, which 2 rivers unite near Allahabad. My impressions of the Doab are of alluvial plains cleared by the Brahmins 20 centuries before the Christian era, farming operations of the rudest description carried on by the peasantry, vast canal works due to English engineers, fields of the cotton plant, which especially thrives in this part of the country, the groans of the cotton mill machinery at work near every village, mingled with the songs of the men who are employed about it. We went on our way very comfortably. Scenery and situations changed before our eyes, while we enjoyed in luxury the climax of the art of locomotion. What mode of progression could be superior to this? We reached the left bank of the Jumna. This important stream forms the boundary of Rajasthan, the country of the Rajas, dividing it from Hindustan, or the country of the Hindus. We found that an early flood had already raised the waters of the Jumna. The current was rapid, but although this made our transit somewhat less easy, it did not hinder it at all. Banks took some few precautions, found a suitable landing place, and within half an hour steam house was mounting the opposite bank of the river. Railway trains require massive bridges to be built at great expense. One of these, of tubular construction, spans the Jumna at the fortress of the Pelamgir near Delhi. But our behemoth drew his double cars over the surface of the current with as much ease as along the best macadamized high road. Beyond the Jumna lay several of the towns which our engineer intended to pass by unvisited. Among these was Gwalior, situated near the river Sawanika, built on a basaltic rock, with its superb mosque of Musjid, its palace of Pal, its curious gate of the elephants, its famous fortress, and the Vira, erected by Buddhists. The modern town of Lashkar, built at a little distance, forms a singular contrast to this ancient city, and competes in trade with it vigorously. It was at Gwalior that the Rani of Jhansi, the devoted friend of Nana Sahib, defended herself heroically to the last. There, as we have already said, she fell by the hand of Colonel Munro during an engagement with 2 squadrons of the British troops, where he was in command of a battalion of his regiment, and from that moment dated the mortal hatred borne towards him by the nabob, who sought till death to gratify it by revenge. Yes, it certainly was desirable that Sir Edward Munro should not renew his recollections of the scenes which took place before the gates of Gwalior. After Gwalior we passed Antri, and its vast plain broken by numerous peaks, like islands in an archipelago. Then Dutia, which has not been in existence for more than 5 centuries. It possesses a central fortress, elegant houses, temples of various forms, the deserted palace of Bursing Dio, and the arsenal of Tope Khana, the whole forming the capital of the province of Dutia, which lies in the northern angle of Bundelkund, and is under British protection. Antri and Dutia, as well as Gwalior, were seriously compromised by the insurrectional disturbances of 1857. On the 22nd of September, Jhansi was passed at a considerable distance. This city is the most important military station in the Bundelkund, and the spirit of revolt is strong in the lower classes of its population. The town is comparatively modern, and has a great trade in Indian muslins and blue cotton cloths. There are no ancient remains in this place, but it is interesting to visit its citadel, whose walls the English artillery and projectiles failed to destroy. Also the necropolis of the Rajas, which is remarkably picturesque. This was the chief stronghold of the Sepoy mutineers in central India. There the intrepid Rants instigated the first rising, which speedily spread throughout the Bundelkund. There Sir Hugh Rose maintained an engagement which lasted no less than 6 days, during which time he lost 15% of his force. There, in spite of the obstinate resistance of a garrison of 12,000 sepoys, and backed by an army of 20,000, Tantia Topi, Balaurao, brother of the Nana, and last not least, the Rani herself, were compelled to yield to the superiority of British arms. It was there at Jhansi that Colonel Munro had saved the life of his sergeant McNeill, and given up to him his last drop of water. Yes, Jansi, of all places, must be avoided in a journey where the route was planned and marked out by Sir Edward's warmest friends. After passing Jansi, we were detained for several hours by an encounter with travellers of whom Kalagani had previously spoken. It was about 11 o'clock. Breakfast was over, and we were lounging under the veranda, or in the saloon, while Behemoth plodded steadily on at a moderate speed. The road was magnificent. Shaded by lofty trees, it passed through fields of cotton and grain. The weather was fine, the sun very hot. All we could wish for was a metropolitan water cart to keep down the puffs of fine white dust which occasionally rose round our equipage. But after a while the atmosphere appeared to become absolutely darkened with clouds of dust as dense as any ever blown up by the simoon of the Libyan desert. "I cannot imagine the cause of such a phenomenon," said Banks, "for the wind blows quite a light breeze." "Probably Kalagani can explain it," said Colonel Munro. He was called, and entering the veranda, looked along the road, and at once said, "It is a long caravan going northward, and is most likely a party of the Benjaris I spoke of to you, Mr. Banks." "Ah, and no doubt you will find some old friends among them." "Possibly, Sahib. I lived a long time among those wandering tribes." "Perhaps you will want to leave us and join them again," remarked Captain Hood. "Not at all," answered Kalagani. Half an hour later, it was proved that his opinion was correct. A moving wall of oxen advanced, and our mighty elephant himself was brought to a standstill. There was nothing to regret in this enforced halt. However, for a most curious spectacle was presented to our observations. A drove of 4,000 or 5,000 oxen encumbered the road, and, as our guide had supposed, they belonged to a caravan of Benjaris. "These people," said Banks, "are the Zingaras of Hindostan. They are a people rather than a tribe, and have no fixed abode, dwelling under tents in summer, in huts during the winter or rainy season. They are the porters and carriers of India, and I saw how they worked during the insurrection of 1857. By a sort of tacit agreement between the belligerents, their convoys were permitted to pass through the disturbed provinces. In fact, they kept up the supply of provisions to both armies. If these Benjaris belonged to one part of India more than to another, I should say it was the Rajputna, and perhaps more particularly the kingdom of Milwar. Pray examine them attentively, my dear Muckler, as they pass before you in defile." Our equipage was prudently drawn up on one side of the great highway. Nothing could have withstood this avalanche of horned cattle. Even wild beasts hastened out of their way. Following Banks' advice, I set myself to observe closely the enormous procession as it passed by, and the first thing I noticed was that our steam elephant, so accustomed to create surprise and admiration, seemed scarcely to attract the attention of these people at all. They looked as if nothing ever could astonish them. Both men and women of the race were extremely handsome, the former tall and strong, with fine features, curly hair, and a clear bronze complexion. They wore long tunics and turbans, and carried lances, bucklers or round shields, and large swords slung across their shoulders. The latter, also very tall and well formed, were dressed in becoming bodices with full skirts, and loose mantle enveloping the whole form in graceful drapery. They wore jewels in their ears, and necklaces, bracelets, bangles, and anklets made of gold, ivory, or shells. Thousands of oxen paced quietly along with these men, women, old men, and children. They had neither harness nor halter, only bells or red tassels on their heads, and double packs thrown across their backs, which contained wheat and other grains. A whole tribe journeyed in this manner, under the directions of an elected chief, called the Nayak, whose power is despotic while it lasts. He controls the movements of the caravan, fixes the hours for the start and the halt, and arranges the dispositions of the camp. I was struck by the magnificent appearance of a large bull, who with superb and imperial step led the van. He was covered with a bright and coloured cloth, ornamented with bells and shell embroidery, and I asked Banks if he knew what was the special office of this splendid animal. "Kalligani will of course be able to tell us," answered he. "Where is this fellow?" He was called, but did not make his appearance, and search being made, it was found he had left Steam House. "No doubt he has gone to renew acquaintance with some old comrade," said Colonel Munro. "He will return before we resume our journey." This seemed very natural. There was nothing in the temporary absence of the man to occasion uneasiness, but somehow it haunted me uncomfortably. "Well," said Banks, "to the best of my belief, this bull represents, or is an emblem of, their deity. Where he goes they follow, where he stops they encamp. But of course we are to suppose he is in reality under the secret control of the Nyack. Anyhow, he is to these wanderers an embodiment of their religion." The cortège seemed interminable, and for 2 hours there was no sign of an approaching end. Soon afterwards, however, the rear guard came in sight, and at last I perceived Kalligani accompanied by a native who was not of the Brinjari type. They were conversing together very coolly, and he was no doubt one who, as Kalligani had frequently done, had joined the caravan for a time only. Probably they were talking of the country which the caravan had just passed through, and across which lay the route by which our new guide had undertaken to lead us. This man, who was the last of all the procession to pass us, paused for a moment before Steam House. He looked at the equipage with some interest, and I thought his eye rested particularly on Sir Edward Munro, but without uttering a word, he made a parting sign to Kalligani, rejoined the troop, and disappeared in a cloud of dust. Kalligani then came up, and before any questions were asked, addressed himself to Colonel Munro, and simply saying, "One of my old comrades who has been with the caravan for the last 2 months," he resumed his place in our train, and we were speedily moving along a road now deeply marked by the footprints of thousands of men and oxen. Next day, the 24th of September, we halted to pass the night a little to the east of Orkcha, on the left bank of the Betwa, which is one of the chief tributaries of the Jumna. There is nothing to see or say about Orkcha. It is the old capital of Bundelkund, and was a flourishing town during the earlier part of the 17th century. But hard blows from the Marathas on one side and the Mongols on the other reduced it to a low condition, from which it has never recovered, so that at the present time one of the great cities of central India is nothing more than a large village, miserably housing a few hundred peasants. I said we encamped on the banks of the Betwa, but the halt was made at some distance from the river, which we learned had considerably overflowed its banks. Night was coming on, and it would be necessary next day to examine carefully the nature of the ground before attempting a passage. We therefore spent our evening in the usual way, and retired to rest. Except under very peculiar circumstances, we never kept watch by night. There seemed to be no occasion for it. Could anybody run away with our houses? No. Could they steal our elephant? Rather not. Nothing was more unlikely than an attack of thieves, but at all times our 2 dogs, Fan and Niger, were on the alert, and ready to give notice of approaching footsteps. This very thing happened that night. Their violent barking aroused us about 2 in the morning. When I opened the door of my room, I found all my companions on foot. "Is anything the matter?" inquired Colonel Munro. "The dogs seem to think so," replied Banks. "I don't believe they would bark like that for nothing." "I should not wonder if a panther had coughed in the jungle," said Hood. "Let's take our guns and make a search." McNeil, Kalagani, and Gwami were all out listening and trying to find out what was going on. We joined them. "Well," said the captain, "I suppose a few wild animals have passed on their way to the drinking place?" "Kalagani thinks this is something very different," replied Sergeant McNeil. "What then, Kalagani?" "I don't know yet, Colonel," said the Indian, "but certainly neither panthers, tigers, nor jackals. I fancy I can discern a confused mass among the trees." "Let's have at them at once," exclaimed the captain, with eager hopes of his 50th tiger. "Wait, Hood, wait," said Banks. "Caution is desirable in this case." "But we are in force and well armed. I want to be at the bottom of this disturbance," persisted the captain. "All right, then," cried Banks. "Munro, you must remain in camp with McNeil and the other men, while Hood, Mockler, Kalagani, and I go to reconnoitre." All this time the dogs continued to bark, but without any symptoms of the fury which they always displayed on the approach of wild beasts. "Come along, Fox," cried Captain Hood, beckoning to his servant. Fan and Niger darted into the thicket. We followed them, and presently distinguished the sound of footsteps. It seemed as though the scouts of a large party were prowling round our camp. A few figures vanished silently among the bushes. The two dogs, barking loudly, ran backwards and forwards some paces in advance of us. "Who goes there?" shouted Captain Hood. No answer. "These people either do not choose to speak or else understand no English," said Banks. "Well, give it them in Hindustani. Tell them we will fire if they don't answer." In the dialect of Central India, Kalagani summoned the invisible rovers to advance and show themselves. Still no answer. A rifle shot broke the silence. The impetuous captain could stand it no longer, and had taken aim apparently at a shadow flitting through the trees. The report was followed by a confused rushing sound, as if a multitude of people were dispersing right and left. Fan and Niger ran forwards, and then returning to us quietly, showed no further uneasiness. "Well, they beat a retreat double quick, these fellows, whoever they were," exclaimed Hood. "That is very certain," returned Banks. "And now, whether they were robbers or rovers, all we have to do is get back to Steam House. But we must set a watch till daybreak." In a very few minutes we had rejoined our party. McNeil, Gwami, and Fox arranged to take turns as sentries, and we once more retired to our cabins. The night passed without disturbance. It was clear that, seeing we were on our guard, the visitors had decamped. Next day, the 25th of September, while preparation was being made for a start, Colonel Munro, Hood, McNeil, Kalagani, and I set out to explore the borders of the forest. We saw no trace whatever of the nocturnal adventurers, and on our return found Banks busily arranging for the passage of the river Betwa, whose tawny waters were flowing far beyond their accustomed bed. The current was running at so rapid a rate that Behemoth would have had to make head against it to avoid being carried downstream. The engineer, field glass in hand, was endeavouring to determine our landing place on the opposite bank. The Betwa was at this point about a mile in width. Our train had as yet crossed no river so broad. "What," said I, "becomes of travellers and traders when they are stopped by floods like this? These currents resemble rapids. Ordinary ferry boats could not resist them." "Why, it is quite simple," replied Captain Hood. "They stay where they are." "They can always cross if they have elephants," said Banks. "You don't mean to say elephants can swim such distances?" "Of course they can, and the thing is managed thus," answered the engineer. "All the baggage is placed on the backs of these." "Proboscideans," suggested Hood, recollecting his friend the Dutchman's fine words; "and the mahouts force them, at first reluctantly, to enter the stream. The animals hesitate, draw back, trumpet loudly, but finally make up their minds to face the difficulty, and beginning to swim, gallantly effect the passage. It must be admitted that some are occasionally swept away by the current and drowned, but that rarely happens if any experienced person is in charge." "Well," said Hood, "Behemoth is thoroughly amphibious, and no doubt will make a fine passage." We all took our places, Caluth by his furnace, Storr in the huddah, Banks acting as steersman. With gentle pace the elephant began his march. His great feet were covered, but the water was for about 50 feet too shallow to float him. Great caution was requisite, and the train moved slowly from terra firma. All of a sudden we became aware that the sounds we had heard in the night were renewed and drawing near us. About 100 creatures, gesticulating and grimacing, issued from the woods. "Monkeys, by Jove!" exclaimed Hood, with a burst of laughter, as the whole regiment of apes advanced in close order towards Steam House. "What on earth do they want?" inquired McNeil. "Of course they are going to attack us," answered the belligerent captain. "No, you have nothing to fear," said Kalagani, who was watching them. "Well, but what are they up to?" repeated McNeil. "They only want to cross the river with us," said the Indian. And Kalagani was right. These were not insolent gibbons, with long hairy arms and importunate manners, nor were they members of the aristocratic family which inhabit the palace at Benares, but black monkeys, the largest in India, very active, and with white whiskers round their smooth faces, which make them look like old lawyers. In fantastic airs and attitudes they almost rivaled our friend Matthias Van Guiet himself. I then learned that these apes are sacred throughout India. One legend asserts that they are the descendants of Rama, who conquered the island of Ceylon. At Amber they occupy the Zenana Palace, and do the honours to visitors. It is expressly forbidden to kill them. Several English officers have lost their lives through disregard of this law. These monkeys are usually very gentle and easily domesticated, but are dangerous if attacked, and when only slightly wounded, become, according to the statement of M. Louis Rousselet, quite as formidable as hyenas or panthers. But we had no intention of attacking them, and Captain Hood's gun was not called into requisition. Could Kalagani be right in saying that these creatures, unable otherwise to cross the river, intended to avail themselves of our floating equipage? We were speedily to see that it was so. When, after passing through the shallows, Behemoth reached the bed of the river, our train floated after him, and encountering a kind of eddy from the turn in the bank, remained at first almost stationary. Just then the troop of monkeys approached, wading and dabbling in the shallow water. They made no demonstration of hostility, but suddenly the whole party, males, females, old and young, began to gambol and spring towards us, and finally seizing each other by the hand, they fairly bounded up on our train, which actually seemed to be waiting for them. In a few seconds there were a dozen on Behemoth's back, 30 on the top of each carriage, and soon we had quite 100 passengers, gay, familiar, even talkative, at least among themselves, no doubt congratulating one another on the fortunate chance by which they had secured their passage across the river. Behemoth now fairly entered the current, and boldly facing it, proceeded on his way. For an instant Banks looked anxiously at the apes, but they disposed themselves judiciously so as to trim the flotilla. They sat or clung in all directions over the back of the elephant, on his neck, on his tusks, even on his upraised trunk, caring nothing for the jets of steam which it cast forth. They clustered on the arched roofs of our carriages, some squatting down, some standing upright, some on all fours, others dangling by the tail from the veranda roofs. Steam House maintained its equilibrium, and the excess of cargo proved to be quite immaterial. Captain Hood was immensely amused, and his man Fogg successively astonished. He soon made friends with the free and easy creatures, who were grimacing on all sides of him, and began to do the honours of the house. He talked to them, shook hands, made his best bows, offered lumps of sugar, and would willingly have handed sweetmeats all round if Monsieur Parizade would have allowed it. Behemoth worked his 4 feet strenuously. They beat the water and acted like paddles. Drifting downwards in the current, he followed the direction which took us towards the landing place. This we safely reached in about half an hour, and the moment our train touched the shore, the whole troop of monkeys sprang down, and with numberless absurd antics and capers scampered off as hard as they could go. "They might as well have said 'Thank ye,'" cried Fawkes, quite disgusted with the bad manners of his fellow passengers. Chapter 7.